The morning I signed the papers on the Harlan County Vineyard, the notary didn't look up from his desk once. Not when I slid my ID across to him, not when I initialed each page, not when I handed back his pen. He just stacked the documents into a manila folder, stamped the top sheet, and said to the realtor standing behind me, not to me, to him, she's going to want to keep the county assessor's number handy for when she's ready to unload it. I was 19 years old. I had $7,400 in a checking account I'd opened at 18 and a used 2009 Ford F-150 with 112,000 miles on it. The realtor, a man named Duval who wore a bolo tie and smelled faintly of menthol cough drops, had spent most of the drive out to Harlan County explaining to me, in the patient voice of someone explaining things to a child, that the Pruitt Vineyard hadn't produced a sellable harvest in 11 years, that the irrigation infrastructure was compromised, that the prior owner had let the rootstock go to wood. I told him I knew. He told me I didn't understand what that meant. Maybe he was right. But I had something he didn't, which was 47 pages of my grandmother's handwriting, held together with a rubber band in the glove box of my truck, and those pages said different. This is Eastern Kentucky, Harlan County. The kind of place where people know your last name before you speak it because it belongs to someone who worked the land nearby for 40 years and left something behind. A reputation, a debt, a story. My grandmother worked 12 acres of slopeside vineyard from 1979 until 2003, when her hands gave out and she moved herself into a single room at my mother's house in Lexington and never came back east. She died in February of the year I turned 18, and she left me the land and the notebooks and not one word of explanation. The notebooks were agricultural, part diary, part log, part argument with herself. Row by row, season by season, the precise iron gall ink of a woman who had learned to keep records because nobody else was going to keep them for her. She wrote in them the way some people pray. Steadily, every night, whether or not anything had happened worth recording. The land itself looked like a punishment. 43 acres, most of it slope. The vines had gone silver and skeletal. The pump house roof had partially collapsed inward sometime in the last 5 years and taken part of the east wall with it. The soil looked exhausted, pale clay where it should have been dark, crusted at the surface, cracked in long shallow lines like something dried too fast. Duval stood at the fence line and looked out across it and didn't say anything, which was the most honest thing he'd done all day. I stood next to him and thought, she grew wine here for 24 years. She grew wine here for 24 years. I kept coming back to that. Not as an inspiration, more as a fact I was trying to hold the correct weight of, like a stone you pick up not knowing if it's ordinary or not. Duval cleared his throat. He had the particular kind of patience men use, when they've already decided they're waiting for you to agree with them. I know someone, he said, developer out of Charlottesville. He's been buying distressed agricultural parcels along this whole corridor. Fair price, clean close, 30 days. You wouldn't have to touch a thing. I looked at the vines. The cordon wire had sagged in 3 places where the posts had heaved out of the frost line. Probably 2 winters ago, maybe 3. The trunks were old, gnarled at the base in the way that means decades, not years. They weren't dead. I could see that even then, even knowing almost nothing, dead vines go gray and papery. These were silver, yes, but dense, hard. They had pulled back to something essential, and they were waiting. I'll think about it, I said. He gave me the card. I put it in my coat pocket, and I have not looked at it since. That night I slept on a cot I'd set up in the front room because the upstairs smelled of mildew, and I hadn't located the source yet. The electricity worked. The well pump ran loudly with a rattle in the pressure tank that needed attention, but it ran. I ate a peanut butter sandwich and read her notebook by the light of a single lamp I'd brought from home. She dated every entry. The one I opened to was from late April 21 years ago. She wrote, cane count on the old block looks poor, 30% of the shoots coming off blind. Weather or pruning error? I think pruning error, mine, from 2 seasons back. A mistake takes that long to show itself here. That is what I am learning. The land does not argue with you immediately. I read that 3 times. Then I got up and walked out to the barn with the lamp, which was foolish, but I needed to see the notebooks she'd kept in there. She had mentioned a second set in one of the entries, a working log separate from the personal one, stored in a tin box on the beam shelf above the old fermenting tanks. The barn door dragged on a warped hinge. I pushed it open with my shoulder and stood in the entrance while the cold came out at me, and the smell? Hay, old wood, something ferrous, something sweet underneath, like dried must, like the ghost of a harvest. The fermenting tanks were still there, 3 of them oak with iron bands gone rust orange along the staves. And on the beam shelf above them, exactly where she'd written it would be, a flat tin box. The box was heavier than it looked. I lifted it down with both hands and carried it to the doorway where the lamplight was better, and I set it on the ground and crouched over it. The latch was a simple tongue and groove, swollen with age, and it took me a minute to work it free without bending the metal. When the lid came up, I could smell it before I saw anything, a dry, papery smell, and beneath that something faintly acidic, like old vinegar, like something that had once been alive and fermenting and had simply gone still. Inside, a stack of notebooks, not one. 7 of them, each about the size of my palm, bound in brown cloth that had gone soft at the corners. Beneath them, folded pages, loose sheets covered in columns of numbers, dates, yield records by row number and variety. And at the bottom of the stack, a single folded map, hand-drawn. The vineyard as it had been, I guessed, in its best years, 41 rows labeled by variety. Pencil annotations in margins so small I had to tilt the lamp to read them. Drains slow here, frost pocket, watch March. This block always ripens last, do not rush it. I sat down on the ground right there in the barn doorway with the cold coming in off the dark, and I opened the first notebook. She had dated every entry, not just month and year, day of the week too, and often the time. Tuesday, March 14th. 7 in the morning, hard frost last night, down to 28 degrees. Walked the rows before breakfast. Checked for bud damage on the marquette block, none visible yet. Will know in a week. I recognized the handwriting from the personal journal, but the register was different, clipped, observational. No feeling in it at all, or the feeling was all in the precision, in the fact that she had been out there at 7 in the morning in a hard frost carrying enough to check every bud. That was the feeling. I sat there long enough that the lamp began to dim and I had to turn it up. I was on the 4th notebook, reading an entry from a late September she had called The Difficult Harvest, Bricks Too Low, a Wet August, a decision she'd made to wait another 12 days against everyone's advice, when I heard the sound outside. Not the wind, something deliberate. Footsteps on gravel, slow and stopping, the way a person walks when they are trying to decide something. I closed the notebook. I set it carefully back in the tin box. I stood up in the barn doorway with the lamp held low and looked out into the dark of the drive, and after a moment I could make out the shape of a person standing at the fence line near the road, just standing there, looking at the vineyard. I didn't call out right away. I had learned, in the 8 months since I'd come to this county, that announcing yourself too fast in the dark was a kind of weakness. It said you were nervous, and I wasn't exactly, but I was careful. I stood in the barn doorway with the lamp at my hip, and I watched the shape at the fence. It was a man. Older from the posture, the slight forward lean, the hands gripping the top rail the way people grip things when their backs ache. He wasn't hiding. He was just standing there the way you stand at a grave or at a window looking into a room you used to live in. I walked towards him slowly. The gravel under my boots announced me anyway. He turned before I was halfway down the drive. He didn't startle. He just turned the way a man turns when he's been expecting something for a long time. He was somewhere in his mid-70s, I thought. Canvas jacket, the kind with the corduroy collar worn down to almost nothing. A hat he held now in both hands in front of him, which struck me as formal at that hour on a dirt road in October. He looked at the lamp. He looked at my face. He said he was sorry for coming so late, and that he had driven past 3 times this week and couldn't make himself stop until now. I asked him what he wanted. He said he used to work this property, not for my grandfather, for the woman before him. He said a name I recognized from the notebooks, the one whose handwriting I had been reading for 2 hours. He said he'd been a young man then, 19, hired for a single harvest season, and that he had stayed for 11 years because of what she knew about the vines. I felt something shift in my chest, not dramatically. Just a small, careful movement, the way a door moves in a room when a window opens somewhere else in the house. He asked if the tin box was still there. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at his hands on the hat brim, the way his fingers worked it slowly. Not from nerves, but from some old habit of patience. I asked him how he knew about the tin box. He said he was the one who'd buried it. The lamp threw a low orange circle around us both, not reaching the vines, just the fence and the gravel and the two of us standing in the cold dark of a Tuesday night in the third week of October. He said she had asked him to bury it before the property sold. She had said that whoever came next and was serious about the land would find it eventually, and that if they found it and read it, they would know what to do with what was inside. He paused. He said he had never expected the next serious person to be 19 years old. I told him I was 19 for 3 more weeks. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't quite not one either. He turned the hat in his hands one more complete rotation and then went still. The lamp buzzed faintly above us, a small sound like a single bee. I asked him what was in the box that she wanted the next person to have. He looked out at the vineyard, the way people look at things they have been looking at for decades. Not seeing the present shape of it, but some earlier version laid over it like a transparency on a projector. He said he hadn't opened it. He said she'd given it to him sealed, and he'd buried it sealed, and that was the arrangement. He said it wasn't his to read. I believed him. I'm not sure why exactly, except that a man who wanted something from me wouldn't have waited 3 weeks after the deed transferred to knock on my door. He'd come because I'd found the box. He'd heard it somehow, probably through whoever runs the feed counter at Larimer's, where everything travels eventually, and he wanted to know if I'd found the papers inside, and if I'd understood them. I asked what kind of papers. He said maps, mostly, drawn by hand, and a letter. The cold was settling heavier now. October in this part of Yamhill County comes down in layers in the evening. First the damp from the coast, then the chill off the hills, then the thing underneath those that I still don't have a word for, that mineral stillness that comes from the ground itself after sundown. I had been outside for 20 minutes, and I could feel it in my collarbone. I told him to come inside. He wiped his boots without being asked, carefully, twice each, and stood in my kitchen without touching anything, which told me something. A man who has spent his life in other people's houses knows how to hold himself in them. He sat where I pointed and put his hat on his knee and looked at the table. I put the tin box on the table between us. He looked at it for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly the way jaws move when a person is controlling something they do not intend to show. Then he looked up at me and said she had planted this vineyard in 1971. Not her husband, not any hired hand her. She had ordered the rootstock herself from a nursery in Napa, and she had driven down to pick it up because she didn't trust shipping. And she had planted every row herself that spring while her husband was in the hospital in Portland for something nobody discussed. And the vineyard had been hers in every way that mattered for the 31 years she ran it. He said most people in the county had forgotten that or maybe never known it. I opened the box. Inside the tin box were 3 things. The first was a folded piece of paper, the kind used for letters, cream-colored and thin, with a watermark I could see when I held it toward the window. It was a receipt from a nursery in Napa Valley dated March 4, 1971. 60 rootstock cuttings, Pinot Noir clone, and 48 Chardonnay. The total came to $83.40 paid in cash. Her handwriting was in the margin, a single line, small and slanted. First row goes east-west, full morning light. The second was a photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed along the top edge. She was younger than I had ever seen her, standing at the end of a plowed row in rubber boots that came to her knees, holding a short-handled dibber in one hand and squinting into the light. She was not smiling the way people smile for cameras. She was smiling at something off to the left, something the photograph didn't include. The row behind her stretched back further than I could measure. The hills in the background I recognized as the ridgeline north of the property. The third thing was a folded index card. On it, in different ink, older and darker, was a list of numbers, 12 rows, numbered 1 through 12, each with a grape variety written beside it, and a notation I didn't understand at first. Dates, I realized, not planting dates, the dates of first harvest from each row. Earliest, row 7, September 14, 1974. She had waited 3 years and then written down the exact date. The old man across from me watched me read through all of it. He didn't fill the silence. He let me take the full minute I needed. When I looked up, I said I didn't understand why these were sealed away, why nobody had brought them out in the years since she died. He said it quietly, without blame. They hadn't known what they were looking at. The family had seen the vineyard fail and assumed the whole project had been a mistake, her mistake. The tin went into the cellar with things nobody wanted to sort through. That was 11 years ago and nobody had sorted through it since. I looked back down at the photograph. Her rubber boots, the plowed row. He said there was something else he thought I should know, something not in the box. He said she had kept a working journal the whole time she ran the vineyard, a proper one, not just notes. He had seen her writing in it dozens of times over the years. He didn't know what had become of it after she died. He had always assumed it was lost. I thought about the cellar, the shelves I hadn't reached the far end of yet. I asked him what it looked like. He said it was green, cloth cover the size of a school notebook. She had kept it in the barn. I thanked him and set the phone down on the kitchen table without hanging up first. I don't know why, I just needed both hands free, needed to stand still for a second without the weight of the receiver. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and the wind coming around the northeast corner of the house. That particular low note it makes in February when there's nothing left in the fields to slow it down. The barn. She had kept it in the barn, and the barn was the one building on this property I had not yet gone through completely. Not because I was avoiding it. I had been in there dozens of times, had moved the hay, had checked the roof joists, had found the old grape press under a canvas tarp in the far stall, and photographed it for the insurance inventory. But the back section, the part that had been walled off at some point with rough-cut boards nailed horizontal, I had not opened. The boards were old. The nails were the cut iron kind, not wire nails, which meant whoever did it had done it before 1940, or had used salvaged lumber from something older still. I had looked at it twice and told myself it was a storage partition and that I'd get to it. I picked the phone back up. He was still there, waiting. I asked him when she had built the partition in the back of the barn. There was a pause long enough that I thought the line had dropped. Then he said he didn't know there was a partition. He had stopped going into the barn regularly after his hip surgery in 2019. Before that, he said, the back section had always been her room. That was what he called it, her room, and she had kept it latched from the inside when she was working. Her room, I wrote those two words in my notebook, not because I would forget them. Because writing them down made them real in a way that hearing them hadn't quite done. I told him I was going out to the barn. He said to be careful of the floor in the back section, that there had been a soft spot near the north wall 15 years ago, and he didn't know if it had ever been repaired. I said I would watch my footing. He said one more thing before I rang off. He said that she had been very particular about that space, that she had not let anyone in there while she was alive, and that if the journal was anywhere on this property, it was behind those boards. I put on my grandfather's coat. The one I had found on the hook behind the cellar door my first week here, olive canvas, with a broken zipper I'd replaced myself. I pulled on my boots. Outside the window, the light was going flat and gray, that mid-afternoon dimming that in February means you have maybe 2 hours before full dark. I went to find what she had kept latched. The barn door was original to the 1940s construction, 2 vertical planks wide, hung on a track that had rusted enough to make every opening a negotiation. I had learned to lift slightly on the handle while pulling, taking the weight off the bottom wheel. It shrieked anyway. It always shrieked. Inside smelled the way that barn always smelled in winter. Cold hay, old motor oil, the particular mineral damp of concrete that has absorbed decades of weather. The light came through 2 small windows on the east wall, both filmed with grime, so the interior was the color of weak tea. I stood still for a moment and let my eyes adjust. The front section I knew well. The John Deere 4020, a 1968 model my grandfather had bought used in 1974, sat under a canvas tarp I had staked down against the wind. Tools hung on pegboard along the south wall, most of them mine now in practice if not yet entirely in habit, the ones I reached for without thinking, the ones whose weight I knew. A workbench along the east wall with a vise bolted to the far end, its jaws slightly open, holding nothing. The back section was separated by an interior wall that had not been original to the build. Someone had added it later, rougher lumber, a different nail pattern. There was a door in it plain, with a surface-mounted latch, the kind with a swinging bar that drops into a keeper, and above the latch, a hasp with a padlock that was the size of my fist and the color of old blood. I stood in front of it for a moment. The padlock was a Master No. 3, the older style with a solid brass body. I had seen its twin on the root cellar door. I went back to the workbench and opened the second drawer from the left, the one where I had been collecting keys found in various corners of the property over the past 8 months. 7 of them now, on a bent ring, none of them labeled. I tried the first, too small. The second was a skeleton key for a door lock, wrong type entirely. The third caught the keyway but wouldn't turn. The fourth didn't enter at all. The fifth was a barrel key for something I had never identified. The sixth slid in, met resistance, and then, with pressure I applied slowly, not forcing it, turned. The shackle released with a sound that was softer than I expected, almost polite. I pulled the hasp clear and lifted the latch bar. The door opened inward, pulling against its own swollen bottom edge, and I pushed it the last few inches with my shoulder. The smell that came out was different from the rest of the barn, drier, older. Something faintly chemical beneath the dust, not unpleasant but specific. I recognized it but could not immediately place it. I stepped through. The room was narrow, maybe 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep. The ceiling was lower than the rest of the barn's ground floor, which meant it had been built as a separate structure first, then surrounded later when the barn was expanded. There was a single shelf running the full length of the left wall, about chest height, and on it sat 14 glass demijohns, the old kind, 5-gallon, encased in wicker that had dried to the color of straw. Below the shelf on the floor were 3 wooden crates stacked too high. In the far right corner stood a workbench no larger than a school desk, and on it sat a small scale, the kind used to weigh letters or small quantities of dry material, and beside the scale, a leather notebook with a strap closure, narrow as a prayer book. I did not touch anything immediately. I stood in the doorway for a moment and let my eyes adjust, let the room become real to me before I disturbed it. The smell I had recognized but not placed, I placed it now, tartaric acid. I knew it from the wine-making notes in my grandmother's ledger. She had described using it to correct acidity in a poor vintage. The residue of it had a particular dry sharpness, almost mineral. It had been sitting in that room, in those glass vessels, or in the wood of the crates, for what looked like a very long time. I moved to the shelf first. I lifted the wicker on the nearest demijohn. The glass inside was dark with sediment, but not broken. I lifted a second same. The third had cracked along its base, and whatever had been inside had evaporated to a dark stain at the bottom of the wicker. 11 of the 14 were intact. Then I went to the workbench. I did not open the notebook yet. I looked at the scale. On the small brass plate beneath the weighing pan, someone had scratched initials, not carved deeply, just scratched with something sharp, a nail or a penknife. 2 letters. The same 2 letters that appeared on the corner post of the oldest section of the Vineyard fence, which I had noticed in March but not understood. Her initials, my grandmother's initials. This room had been hers. I sat down on the edge of the crate closest to the workbench. The wood held. Outside, somewhere past the barn wall, I could hear the creek running. It had been running stronger these past 3 weeks since the rains came, and the sound of it was steady and indifferent and somehow exactly right. I picked up the leather notebook. The strap closure was stiff but not locked. I worked it open slowly. I turned to the first page. The handwriting was small and even slanted slightly to the left, the way older women sometimes wrote, as if the letters were leaning into a wind only they could feel. The ink had faded from black to a brownish gray, but it was still fully legible. The first line was a date, April 14, 1962. Below it in the same even hand, first pressing notes Muscat Blanc, bricks at harvest, 24-2. Press fraction free run only, settled 48 hours cold, rack to glass on the 16th. I sat with that for a moment. Not a journal, a wine log. I turned the page. April through October of 1962, 1 page per batch, each entry the same discipline structure, variety, date of harvest, sugar reading, press method, racking date, barrel number, notes on colors and smell, and what she called feel, which was apparently her word for the way a wine moved when you tilted the glass. There were small pencil drawings in the margins, a cross-section of a cluster, a diagram of a barrel bung with an arrow, and a note, Lose less this way, a sketch of something I didn't immediately recognize, a shallow wooden tray with handles, and beneath it, in parentheses, Dad's design works better than the French one. I kept turning pages. The years moved, 1963, 1964. A gap in 1965, just 2 entries, both in October, the handwriting more compressed, like she was writing quickly or tired. Then 1966 came back full, every month from April onward, and somewhere in that summer the notes started changing. They became less terse. She began adding observations that had nothing to do with chemistry. A late frost that held off by 4 days, the particular way the light fell on the lower block in August, a note about which rose the finches preferred, and what that seemed to predict about sweetness. She was building something, not just wine. A system of attention that had been tested and retested across 20 growing seasons that I could count so far, and the notebook was not even half finished. I looked at the sealed jars along the wall differently now. If each one corresponded to an entry in this log, and the careful labeling I'd already noticed suggested they did, then she hadn't just been making wine in this room. She had been conducting an experiment that lasted decades. The 11 intact jars were not keepsakes. They were evidence. I turned to the last written page. The date at the top stopped me. September 3, 1987. 3 months before she died. The entry was longer than the others, written in a looser hand, and it did not begin with bricks or harvest dates. It began with a name, not my grandfather's, a name I had never heard anyone in my family speak aloud. The name was written in careful block letters at the top of the entry, the way she only wrote things she wanted to be exact about. 7 letters, a man's name. Below it, a date, June 14, 1966, and then a single line. He taught me what the slope was trying to say. I sat with that sentence for a long time. The rest of the entry was not a vineyard log. It was something closer to a reckoning. She wrote about a summer she had spent learning, not from books, not from my grandfather, but from this man, whose name appeared nowhere else in the house that I had ever found. He had worked the vineyard for 1 season, she wrote, passing through on his way somewhere else, and in that season he had shown her how to read the vine's posture in drought, how to distinguish stress from discipline in a wilting leaf, how to taste the soil itself and understand what it was withholding. She wrote that he had grown up in a wine-making family in the Finger Lakes region of New York, that his family had lost their land during a bank dispute in 1952, and that he had spent the years between then and 1966 walking from farm to farm, trading knowledge for room and board. She wrote, he never asked for credit. He said the vines would remember. Then she wrote something that made me set the notebook down on my knee and look at the wall of sealed jars. She had kept 1 jar from every harvest he taught her, not as keepsakes, she wrote, but as proof. Proof that what he showed her worked. Proof that a method passed quietly between 2 people, unrecorded by any extension office or university program, could produce something that lasted. She had planned to find him, she wrote, to bring the jars to him someday and show him what the years had made of his teaching. But she had never located him after that summer. And now she was 63 years old, and her hands ached, and she was leaving this notebook in the room where the work had happened, because she wanted someone to find it who would understand it. She wrote, if you are reading this and you made it this far without stopping, you are the one I was writing. For I noticed I had stopped breathing. Outside, the October light had shifted to the low gold of mid-afternoon. I could hear the vineyard, or maybe I was imagining it, the specific silence of dormant vines in cool air, the way the whole lower block seemed to hold still when the wind paused. I looked at the 11 jars, 20 years of harvests, a method with no name, a man nobody in my family had ever spoken of, and my first harvest still fermenting 60 feet away. I sat with the notebook in my lap until the light through the barn window turned the color of old brass. Then I carried it to the house, set it on the kitchen table next to my own notebook, the one I'd been keeping since March, full of soil readings and vine counts, and the rainfall measurements I'd been recording every week, with a rain gauge I'd found hanging on a nail inside the barn door, and I looked at the 2 of them side by side for a long time. I didn't try to make meaning out of it that afternoon. Some things need a night before you can see them clearly. What I can tell you is this. The 11 sealed jars are now on the shelf above my fermentation tanks, where I see them every morning when I come in. I haven't opened them, I don't plan to. They aren't mine to drink. They're mine to understand, and I'm still understanding them. The wine from that first harvest came out of tank in February, 41 cases, not a large number. Not an impressive number by any commercial measure. But the woman at the small regional competition in Grants Pass held the glass up to the light for a long time before she wrote anything down, and what she wrote I didn't see until later. Unusual depth of soil character, restrained, patient. I thought about that word for a week. Patient. Like patience was something a wine could have, something you could taste. Maybe it is. The neighbors who came to the tasting in May, the ones who had watched me haul brush and pull wire for 8 months, the ones who had been polite about their doubts, which is the particular cruelty of polite doubt, they didn't say much when they tasted it. One of them, the older man who ran the orchard 2 miles east, held his glass for a long time and then looked at me and said, "Your grandmother would have liked this, that was all." It was enough. I think about her often. The woman who bought this dried-up place on a failing block and spent 20 years learning what no one was willing to teach her, and then left her knowledge in a room for someone she would never meet. She wrote for a reader she couldn't name. She trusted the notebook more than she trusted institutions, more than she trusted time. I think that's why she left the jars, not as proof, as company. If you've ever inherited something that looked like a burden, a piece of land, a falling down building, a family name people in town already had opinions about, then you know the specific weight of standing at the beginning of that. You know what it feels like when no one believes the work is worth starting. Start anyway. The answer is almost always in a room you haven't opened yet.